We're going to start off with the individual who won the award in the project category, and that is Rob Nyland, who's sitting right up here.
Hi, how's everyone doing?
We're doing good, Rob.
So I apologize for anybody who's heard this spiel so many times. I talked about it in Dr. Graham's blended learning class. My project evolved a little bit, and it's a little bit different, but it involves something that I've been kind of working with a while with Dr. Davies and John Chapman, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So I should have got this warmed up beforehand. So just a little bit about what we've been doing is we've been working with the Intro to Excel class. Has anyone ever taken that class before? Maybe a few of you. It's taught in the Information Systems program over in the business school, and it's also taught at a few other universities. So we're using this class to look at learning analytics. So the name of our project and the paper we actually just submitted to the Journal of Educational Technology and Society, it's called Transaction Level Learning Analytics and Online Authentic Assessments. So there's a lot of try to cram as many buzzwords into that title as possible. That was really my goal for it. So just by way of introduction, we kind of worked off this premise that sometimes assessment doesn't necessarily give a good or an accurate picture of whether a student has learned something. Especially a lot of times if we use objectively scored assessments that are maybe written just by a regular teacher. The student could just guess the question, and if there's only one question that's covering a particular topic, we don't really have a sense as instructors whether or not the student really understands those things. So they could leave room for possible misconceptions that persist over time. And while Sal Khan maybe doesn't have a lot of clout in academic realm, has anyone read his book, The One World Schoolhouse? It's an interesting read. He talks about kind of the building of Khan Academy, but one thing he talks about is this idea of Swiss cheese learning, and that is that we take all these classes, and this happens in undergraduate education. You take math classes, and you take these other classes, but by the time you get to a class like calculus, all these things that you didn't quite understand in all these other classes, they compound, and you realize that you're really, really struggling. So while you may have done well in these other classes, because there's areas or misconceptions that persisted, you tend to struggle later on. And so we wanted to find ways of really trying to measure that struggle in our project. So the better way to assess is, observing performance and using authentic assessments. So learning analytics, just a quick definition, is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environment in which it occurs. And learning analytics is another, obviously, buzzword that's been thrown around a lot. In Dr. Davies' class this quarter, we're kind of exploring what that means, and it's been a good exercise. I've been working in learning analytics for the last 2 years, but I don't know if I've really learned anything about what that actually means, but it's a lot of different things. But I'd call this project learning analytics. And one thing we've learned is that there's different types of data that you find when working in learning analytics. There's system level data, which kind of collects data at the institutional level. And there's a lot of work being done in kind of early alert systems to see if students are going to drop out based on information that we find in the SIS, the Student Information System. There's also work that's being done with assessment level data, which is test scores, assignment scores. And we wanted to go a level deeper, what we call transaction level data. So transaction level data or log data is you think of a web log, which is a click stream. So all the clicks that the student's going through in order to complete some kind of task. And so we wanted to look at that level to determine what kind of misconceptions exist among students. So our research questions, so to what extent does the use of transaction level data improve our ability to detect knowledge gaps and misconceptions? compared to just using final answer data, just looking at the final submitted answer. which errors are revealed most often by transaction level data and by final solution data, and to what degree can the use of transaction level data identify persistent knowledge gaps and misconceptions held by a student over time. Now, we really consider this, we understand that this project isn't super generalizable. It's a very specific instance of using this type of data, but what's really interesting to me is that more and more we're getting kind of these integrated courseware solutions where you do all of your reading inside of an LMS, you do all of your assessments inside of an LMS, and as a result, they're collecting a lot of data about how students are interacting in these environments. And so we just really wanted to see, okay, what are the potentials for this type of data in helping us understand what students are doing? So data was collected from the online Intro to Excel class. The assessments, they're situated in task-based, so that students would actually download an Excel spreadsheet and have to go through a set of tasks to complete that. And then what's unique about it is that it captures transaction level data, a data log for every attempt that a student makes. And so this is what a student log looks like. We have a user ID, a submission ID. We have the step number that they're working on, so that's, as they're going through, each time they enter something, that's a step. Where in the worksheet, the cell that they're working on, the formula that they put in. So sometimes they may put a formula in and they got the correct answer the first time, or they may consistently be struggling on a particular cell. So you'd see this student's actually doing fairly well. But anytime you'd see multiples of a given cell, that means that they're trying to figure out the answer to that cell over and over. And because we're doing this case study, we wanted to look at a very granular level about what students know. And so we wanted to choose a concept from Excel that might have a lot of, knowledge or misconceptions associated with it. And so we chose to look at absolute references, and that's the $sign. So just a quick thing about absolute references, it's used to, if you're referencing a cell, it's used to hold the position of that cell constant. Because usually when you copy and paste down, it's relative, and so it'll actually reference the cell underneath it as it moves. So absolute reference is a way that you can hold the value of a cell constant, and it's kind of a tricky concept because you have to kind of look ahead to see what you're going to do before to know how you're going to use it. So we collected all the data for the students, and this was probably most of my time on this project was spent in the data cleaning and coding process. So collected data for all the students. We had about 1,000 students that were included in our sample. We created a list of all the possible answers that the students submitted, and what we did is we actually looked at 4 different occasions in the course where they had to use this absolute reference. So we wanted to look longitudinally over the course of how their understanding changed over time. We identify 4 possible errors that could evidence a misconception. So we identified what a correct answer would be, an error where they didn't include an absolute reference when it was needed. They used it when it wasn't needed, so they added an extra one. They use it inappropriately, meaning that they put it on the wrong cell. They held the value of the wrong cell. Or if sometimes they just couldn't figure it out, and so they just typed in the value that they were supposed to do. That's if you just get frustrated, you just that's the cop-out. So we went through and we identified what all of those would look at for each of our 4 problems, and then I went through and kind of created a formula in Excel to automatically code all of the responses, and then we kind of applied a weighting for what we called the error weighting to help identify a number for a student on how much error they had in the process. And we calculated the error for their process and also their final answer, their submitted answer, because we wanted to look at the difference between the process and the final answer. So our first research question is we wanted to see if transaction level data improved our ability to detect student error. And we'll say that we kind of knew beforehand that there was going to be more error in the process than the final answer. Usually students are going to figure it out by the time that they submit it, but we wanted to empirically kind of show some evidence of this. So in lesson 2, the mean error was 0.087, and then the mean error in the final answer is 0.036. And all of these were significantly different with a relatively I would say pretty large effect size, indicating that there is more error in the process than in the final answer alone. So just giving us an idea that there is stuff in this transaction data that can help us understand what students know. We looked at the most commonly found errors in the transaction level data, and kind of the main thing here is we found that error 1, students tended not to, this is the process and final, they tended not to correct those. Those are misconceptions that persisted, and usually the system didn't really figure it out. Error 2, most of these they figured it out by the time that they finished. So those are things that the system itself is giving them feedback. What are the patterns of error over time? This is pretty interesting to us. So we looked at, so if you just look at the process error, not a lot on the first question. And typically, if you look at what's called an error curve, it should go down over time. The more time a student is presented with a question, their knowledge of that should improve over time. But we didn't see that here. So on lesson 2, they had little error. On lesson 3, they're struggling a lot with that same, again, we're looking at the use of absolute references. And then it kind of tapers off for lesson 4 in the midterm. So we don't necessarily know what this means just from the data alone, but there could be some kind of interaction effect with the contexts in which these problems are delivered. Now, one thing I wanted to look at was how students individually are progressing in terms of their knowledge of absolute references over time. So I created this heat map, and I showed it to Dr. Davies. I was like, Dr. Davies, I created this heat map. And he was like, I don't understand it. And so, I don't get it. So what it is each of these, this is all 1,000 students and lined up over time. So a student, if it's white or lighter in color, that means that they had no error in their process. If it's red, it means they had more error. And so what we would expect to find is that students who figured it out in this white area, the next instance they would also be a lighter color, and the next instance it would be a whiter color. But you see that those students who have figured out here have a hard time on the second instance. And then some of those have a hard time, some of them. So there's not really a clear pattern for how students are understanding these things. It's kind of random. So overall, that kind of indicates to us that there should be a little bit more scaffolding and helping with this concept throughout the course. And that, the students are continually struggling with the material. So our conclusions that there is value in collecting deeper forms of data in education, though it may be difficult to process. And I think that's kind of one of the big things we struggle. There's a lot of districts out there, there's a lot of colleges out there that have tons of educational data, but oftentimes they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to process it. But there can be value. We can find things out from them. And another thing is, if we can see a visualization that we see our students are continually struggling with a particular thing in our class, that might be a way that we can provide remediation. And so there's also value in that. And that's my project.
So that was our project recipient. The next category for us is research, and the winner in our research category is Bryce Bunting.
So what I'm going to share today is just kind of a really high-level summary of the work that I did for my dissertation. So I'm going to fly through parts of this pretty quickly because I've got 12 minutes, and you can imagine trying to condense a dissertation into something that's concise, which was a good experience for me. One, to just kind of revisit my findings and what I learned. But two, it's been a little while since I've thought about some of these things again because, like I said, I graduated in December. So the title of my dissertation, I look, just to give you an idea of kind of my context. So I work here on campus in the College of Undergraduate Education. I'm the Associate Director for First Year Mentoring. So my research was really closely married to my professional work here on campus. But just to kind of return to the prompt I asked you to think about, if I could just hear from one of you that thought of an experience that you had as an undergraduate that you felt like was highly impactful for you as a learner, as a person? I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but Jacob. Yeah.
I switched majors from business management to psychology, and in one of my first psychology undergraduate courses, I just had a series of class periods where he would ask questions that would just get me thinking, and I felt like I was belonging, and so that class was the most impactful for me because I felt validated in my switch.
Like you'd found your place. Okay, I saw a hand back here as well. I thought. Okay, maybe not. So for me, my most impactful experience was not in a class. Just quick poll, for those of you that came up with something, how many of you thought of an experience that was outside of a formal class you took? Okay, probably about half. That doesn't surprise me. But for me, the most impactful experience I had was actually working as a peer mentor in what used to be called the Freshman Academy program. It's gone through a few iterations since then. It's structured a little bit differently, but I learned more during those 2 years than I did in any single course or my academic program in general. It changed kind of the way I approached learning, the way I saw myself as a learner, and kind of extended into other parts of my life. I saw the gospel differently. I saw church service differently. I saw my relationships differently. And for a long time, I wondered, what was it about that experience that was so impactful? And that's what I ended up pursuing in my dissertation research, and that's what I'm going to share just a bit about today. So just a bit about my research question. So mostly I was interested in, to begin with, I was interested in understanding what peer mentors learn through the experiences they have supporting first-year students as they transition into higher education. And then from there, as I started to understand some of the outcomes that were associated with that experience, I got more and more curious about what is it about those types of experiences, being a peer mentor or being a peer leader like a resident assistant, a teaching assistant, an orientation leader. I looked a little bit more broadly in the research to find other roles that were related to the specific role I was involved in. And wanted to know what is it about those experiences that has the potential to lead to transformative outcomes and be kind of this high impact experience for students. And ultimately my goal was to not just understand things theoretically, but be able to provide some practical guidance for practitioners that work in programs similar to the one I'm in here at BYU so that they can be more intentional about providing a transformative experience for the students that they work with. And then the further I got, the more I realized that there could be a theoretical contribution to this work, and I might have time to talk about that, but I think 12 minutes will come pretty quickly, so we'll see. As far as the format goes, I did a journal-ready dissertation or multi-article dissertation. I think that's becoming a little bit more common in the department, and Rebecca Thomas, I think, did a master's project looking at some outcomes, traditional dissertation route versus this journal-ready dissertation. I chose this route just because I felt like it eliminated some middle steps that were a bit inefficient in my mind. My goal from the beginning was to publish my work, and so I thought, why not just jump to that point and produce publishable manuscripts as my dissertation. So I wrote 4 articles. The first one has been published. The second one is under review. The third one's under review, and then the fourth one is kind of the orphaned article that I will get to when I've got a little bit more time, but I'm working on that. And they kind of fed into each other. I learned in article number 1 just a bit about generally what peer mentors learn, and then articles 2 and 3 were focused on kind of examining what is it about those experiences that lead to transformative outcomes. And then article number 4 was a bit more practical in that I took what I'd learned in the first 3 studies and developed an intervention designed to further peer mentors learning and development based on what I'd learned in the first 3 studies. Just a word about methods. If you're not laughing, it means you don't come to seminar or don't follow the discussion on Google. I didn't use hermeneutic phenomenology, but that was a really, really funny video. I think Peter had sent it out. Made me laugh. I focused, my methods were largely narrative in nature. I won't say a whole lot about this because we could get into the weeds and it would eat up all the time that we have, but I approached this narratively, and kind of the core assumptions behind narrative research are that experience is worth understanding, and that experience is best understood by examining the stories and narratives that people tell about their experiences or share or articulate about what they're experiencing in their lives. So my approach was to gather, analyze, and then represent peer mentors' stories or narratives of the experiences that they were having as peer mentors. And what I think another important thing to point out is that sometimes when people hear narrative research or narrative inquiry, it's just kind of perceived as, oh, you just like collect stories. You're a story gatherer and storyteller. What makes narrative inquiry what it is and sets it apart from other, just gathering stories like your grandfather might do, or a family history researcher, or whoever, is that there's an attempt to engage in analytic, rigorous analysis of those stories, and then to connect those stories back to the literature base and provide not just rich descriptions of what's going on, but thick descriptions that provide detail and a proxy experience supported by evidence from the literature as well. So that was my approach. I'm just going to spend the rest of my time just sharing a few findings. So this is one of the things that I did in kind of representing my findings was used exemplars. So through the analytic process that I engaged in, identified themes and patterns across all of our participants, but then used some purposeful sampling to identify smaller groups of participants, and in some cases single participants, whose narrative fragments, kind of bits and pieces of their stories, served as exemplars of the general patterns and themes we saw across all of our participants. So this is one of those exemplars from the first article that, again, focused on what do peer mentors learn. So I won't insult your intelligence by reading it to you, but just point out a couple of things. This particular mentor mentioned, when I became a peer mentor, my whole academic focus changed. That's something that we see really consistently in our participants and then across the literature more generally, is that peer leaders often come with a superficial approach to learning. They're typically high-achieving students that have learned how to play the game, do as little as they can to get by, to get good grades. But having this experience of being expected to help other learners improve the way they learn shifts their perspective. And at the end of this narrative, she shared that I was able to become, and I think that's a key word, become the type of learner that every college student has the responsibility to be. So not only had her practices shifted, she was studying differently, engaging in different practices, but in her mind, she'd become a different type of learner. Her identity had shifted. And after that, after we conducted this first study, it got us thinking about connected us to a new literature on transformative learning, and Dr. Yanchar and Dr. Gibbons, who I don't think is here, pointed me in the direction of this literature and really expanded my perspective on what was going on with these participants. That they weren't just learning new practices or new behaviors, but they were experiencing what has been termed in the literature transformative learning or transformational learning in some cases. So it's characterized by not just changes in practice or behavior, but kind of a new worldview, a new perspective, and in some cases a shift in identity. So again, the learner becomes different. They see the world differently. They engage with the world differently. So it moves much deeper than, or far beyond, I use a planner or I go to TA reviews. They see their experiences as learners differently. So at this point, the question that came up after I'd conducted the first study was, again, what is it about these experiences that makes the difference? Because there were some mentors that we interviewed that weren't having this kind of experience. It was just a job to them. They weren't changed by it. It wasn't impactful, but there were some that were. And so we were really interested in understanding, for those that felt that they'd been transformed, what was it about the experience that led to those outcomes? So that was the focus of articles 2 and 3. Article number 2 was similar in structure or I guess methodological approach to number 1. It was based in narrative inquiry practices. And then article number 3 was a literature review that I did as part of Dr. West's 750 class. So plug for that course. It can be a real help to you as you're working on your dissertation. And as we gathered these findings and went back to the literature, because I found myself throughout the dissertation process kind of in this bouncing back and forth between collecting data, analyzing data, asking new questions, going back to the literature. Sometimes I think the perception of research is you do a literature review, you come up with findings, and then you're done. I found myself bouncing back and forth between those stages all the time. But one of the literatures that we were directed to based on the findings of Articles 2 and 3 was some literature on high impact practices. So this is a list of kind of what's sometimes tongue-in-cheek referred to as the anointed 10, but 10 high impact practices that are associated with higher graduation rates, retention rates, and just an overall higher quality undergraduate experience. The real meat of this work, though, is in the kind of the anatomy of those experiences, and these are the characteristics that the American Association of Colleges and Universities have come up with to characterize these experiences. And essentially, to cut right to the chase, what we found was that being a peer mentor, being a peer leader, when it includes these types of experiences or characteristics, has the potential to be transformative or to be a high impact practice. So in kind of the conclusion of my dissertation, where I brought together all 4 of the articles, that's the argument that I made, was that peer mentoring should be considered, or peer leadership should be considered a high impact practice in its own right. And I kind of finished the dissertation by making some theoretical claims. Am I out of time? Is that why we're up here? Okay.
Yeah,
I will.
We love what you're saying.
Okay.
But we do need to.
All right. So just this is the last thing I'll say. So this is the framework that I developed based on the findings of the 4 studies that kind of maps out the types of the components of a high impact peer leadership experience. So routines and practices they're engaged in regularly that kind of introduce a peer mentor to that role. Challenge and unfamiliarity, that could come in dealing with students, taking on new projects or tasks, integrating theory and conceptual understanding into the practice. Reflection was something that came out really clearly as making a big difference, both group reflection, personal reflection, both written and kind of just the reflection that peer mentors engage in based on invitations that are extended by their own mentors or supervisors. And the big thing that came out was that when mentors perceive themselves as being part of a community of practice, that includes opportunities to engage in dialogue with others, ask new questions, have their thinking pushed and challenged, be supported by others in their learning, that more than anything else makes the biggest difference. So in terms of implications, again, I'm trying to get this out into the literature and out through conferences to help people on campuses around the country to be more intentional about providing this kind of experience, both for peer mentors as well as students in general. So, thanks.
Just to introduce myself, I'm Sabrina Hewitt. I graduated in August, and thank you. I taught 4 out of the 5 semesters that I was here. I taught IP&T 287, which is a class that is no longer taught. 334 and 444, and then a pilot class that was IP&T 514R. I've taught about 10 sections total between all of those. So you can see now this is good. Before I started this master's program, I was an elementary school teacher, and all 4 of those classes that I mentioned were geared for elementary education students. And because of my background, I was able to bring a more practical perspective or a different perspective into these classes, which led to the introduction of several new assignments. We taught about grant writing for the first time ever, which was something that I had done as a teacher and is very needful because they're going to go into different situations. We've even had students receive grants that they had written in my class, which was really cool. They got fully funded. We changed an assignment from being an online portfolio to being a class website based on my experience that was more practical and useful in this field. We started teaching the students how to structure internet research projects for their upper grade elementary school students, which we hadn't done before. And I was able to explain to them how to apply what we were learning in class to how they would actually use it in the classroom, which was very valuable. And in some cases, I was even able to show them works that my previous students had made, which I'm going to show you a clip of right now. We teach our students how to make movies, digital stories, and this is a book trailer created by some 5th graders a few years ago.
While looking for food, he stumbled across a glowing chest. Max the most favorite part of all is pursuing what he thinks is the most valuable treasure at sea.
So they made these book trailers, and it really made the learning come alive for my students, that they were able to see elementary school students doing the types of things that we were training them how to do. Next, beyond just applying what I had learned previously in my occupation, this was also a place for me to integrate my new learning that I was acquiring in the program, and it was really fun to have sort of a sandbox where I could try out new theories or new practices that I was getting exposed to. Dr. Peter Rich told me about the program iBooks Author, and he told me about one elementary school that had one grade level doing work with this software, and I latched onto that. I thought it was a really cool and a really powerful thing, and we then had our students create historical iBooks, collaborating with their social studies professors. So here's an example that is a description of Amelia Earhart. And you can see that it comes up with a pretty professional looking product. There's a lot of extra features that you wouldn't be able to get with a physical book. It's a place where they can have increased interactivity. This shows the place where they think that Amelia Earhart disappeared, as well as integrating primary source documents and multimedia. So this is a recording of Amelia Earhart's actual voice.
This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
And that makes history really come alive when you can incorporate those different multimedia elements into the book. I also learned about narrative learning from Dr. Yanchar over here in his Principles of Learning class, and I wanted to see how that would look like in my class, and so I experimented multiple times with different aspects of that theory and evaluating the effect it was having on my students. I was exposed to online discussions in a class that Dr. Graham taught, and I really valued the type of interaction and the level of depth we were able to get in our class discussions. And so I was able to adapt that and try it out in a class that I taught the following semester. So it's been a really fun place for me to learn new things, but then apply them and see how they need to change in a new context. I was also exposed to Drop Thought from Michael Matthews, who's a doctoral student here. And this website gives you access to a constant feedback loop, which was infinitely valuable as I was doing my master's project course. And so I set up, they gave me feedback about every little thing, every class period, every homework, every assignment, and they could just give me a smiley face, semi-smiley face, flat face, frowny face, about each of those things, and if they felt like it, they could also give me feedback. And then I could look at this written feedback and see what exactly it was that they were enjoying or that wasn't working for them in an anonymous way so that it felt more approachable to them. I was able to make changes to my course in the moment from one class period to another and tell them, I received this feedback, this is what I'm doing now. They felt heard. I felt like I was able to have a better course during the first run rather than waiting till the end to summatively assess it. And that was very valuable, as well as the written feedback that I would get from the journal entries I was doing with narrative learning. So I got multiple sources of feedback constantly. Also, I used this opportunity to forge connections that previously hadn't been made with these courses and outside specialists. So I got in contact with the person who teaches the educational technology classes at UVU. She gave me complete access to her courses on Canvas. I was able to see the concepts that she covered and the way that she had set up her course. We also use Canvas, so that was able to migrate really well when I wanted to use some of her content. I phoned district technology specialists and found out what was actually being used out in the 5 partnership districts and made decisions about what was of most value to our students. And I was also able to go to a conference for K-12 online and blended learning that really helped forge new partnerships for us. I met professors who were also creating courses about the same content I was. My master's project was on teaching the elementary school students how to teach in an online or blended elementary school setting. So I found professors who were teaching about that topic at different universities, and we were able to collaborate. I found researchers who were researching this particular topic, and we exchanged contact info. I also found principals and teachers at online and blended K-12 schools, and people from all 3 of those areas became evaluators of the curriculum that I developed for my own course, and so they gave me feedback at the beginning on my course concept and at the end on what I was able to do with the 1 credit hour class. Additionally, I met several vendors of online material in elementary school. Usually the teachers are not the content creators, but usually it's these outside providers. And I was able to talk with many of them, and they gave me varying amounts of access to their software and allowing my students to experience that software as well to get that exposure. So this is my class in Dreambox. Each of my students had their own avatar, and they choose their own picture password. It's not coming up right now, which is exactly how it would show up if they were an elementary school student. As well as ST Math gave us access to the way that they teach mathematics, and I was able to allow my students to experience that. These are all different types of games that teach the same concept, adding and subtracting fractions. Starts at a lower level and goes up to 4. So this was something that was really valuable for my students. They rated it as one of the most highly valuable aspects of the course, that they were able to get exposure to so many different content providers and be able to compare them and have tools to evaluate them with each other. And that is a quick summary of what I was able to do in these 2 years. Thanks.